Octane 2026 not only has the power to render high-fidelity Gaussian splats, but you can also relight them, and even use clipping materials and shapes to uniquely define your splat rendering and so much more. Let's take a look at setting up splat relighting inside Cinema 4D. One of the first things you'll want to do when using the new Splat object is add an Octane Object Tag. Within the tag, you can enable shadow visibility, and this is important if you wish to have self-shadows when relighting a splat. Without this enabled, you can cast shadows onto your splat from 3D geometry, but it will not receive shadows from its own shape. Now when you use the shadow strength inside the splat attributes, you'll see the shadows being generated directly onto the splat. At first glance it may look a bit unsettling, because you have to remember these assets are millions of small orbs, so there is a balance to consider, both the shadow ray offset feature and the intensity. Shadow ray offset will essentially offset the shadow effect directionally, but also diffuse or smooth out the shadows a bit. And this is great for a lot of small floating splats, or if you're trying to get a smooth, stylistic look. The second consideration is the splat intensity. The Gaussian splat itself is a self-illuminating object, so when adding additional light it's important to consider how much internal illumination you want to reduce, and to use almost just as a fill source. For different lighting styles you may find yourself tweaking these values for different effects. I find that when using self-shadows with splats you typically want to pull back with the shadow strength, for a less contrasty look. We'll also look in a bit how to use clamp light without self-shadows to relight stylistically. Let's add some 3D geometry and look at casting shadows from 3D objects. With the shadow visibility in the tag disabled, we can still see really nice shadows casted from the sphere onto the splat object. If we re-enable the shadow visibility, we'll have both self-shading and the 3D geometry casting shadows. These are both controlled by the shadow strength value, so at this moment these values cannot be affected independently. Now let's take a look at stylized lighting with an area light. I consider this to be very similar to light painting. The large soft light effect won't do much for us since it's globally illuminating everything. Even if we have the self-shadows back in, we're flattening everything out with shadow influence. But if we reduce the size of the light and we use an analytic light to control the spread, we'll start to see some nice improvements. And the self-shading in this case is causing too much undesirable contrast, so we can disable them and use the splat's own illumination as its source. What I mean by that is even with an illumination value set, if the light isn't hitting the splat object, it's receiving zero illumination. So this is where the light mode in the splat object is important. If set to none, there is constant emission from the splat. If set to power or power and color, then only if the light touches the splat will the splat illuminate. The self-illumination value, for instance, is a representation of the light ray painting the light. This is a super cool way to use something like an area light to control where we see the illumination from the splat. This is a very powerful thing to understand because now you can use light in unique ways with splats, not only for relighting with shadows, but also more of a light painting method. Now let's take a look at using the clipping material to create unique cutaways for your splats. With the clipping material applied to any 3D geometry, you can trim splats in precise ways at render time. It works just like the clipping material on other 3D objects. You have to ensure the priority of the clipping material is set to a higher value than the priority of the splat object. From there everything works perfectly, and you can cut into, animate through, or merge splats in unique ways with interesting cutout effects. This is something exciting I haven't seen anywhere before. Lastly, let's jump into Octane Standalone and look at exporting SPZ formats from splats. Splats are a real-time asset type, but that doesn't mean they don't get heavy. This splat, for instance, is about 200 megabytes, but renders pretty quickly. However, with Octane's built-in export option, I can export an SPZ from this PLY, and that bakes a new splat file down to about 20 megabytes. This is an excellent way to archive your splats, or have an LOD version to use for splat scattering. If we re-import and take a look, there's barely any noticeable difference in quality, which is amazing. Gaussian splats are an exciting new format, and Octane has one of the most robust solutions out there for 3D artists to explore splats, and integrate them with your 3D scene. Download Octane 2026 today and try out splat rendering for yourself.